It was an unusually quiet morning at the palace. The air outside was cold, and a thin layer of fog rested over the tall black gates. For most people, it was just another day in front of the palace. Tourists slowly gathering, guards standing still, and the sound of carriages and vehicles passing by. But for those who served inside, this was not an ordinary morning. There was something in the air, something unspoken that made the atmosphere feel heavy and different. Among the royal guards stood a man who had served the king for many years. His uniform was neat, his posture straight, and his eyes focused. But deep inside, he carried more than duty, he carried secrets. For years, he had been trusted to keep everything he saw and heard inside the palace private. He had seen moments of great joy like royal weddings and national celebrations. He had also seen quiet moments when the world outside had no idea what was happening behind the palace walls. That morning, he felt the same cold breeze everyone else did, but his heart was warm with memories of the king. He remembered the first day he had taken his position as a royal guard. He had been nervous then, proud to wear the uniform, proud to serve the crown. Over time, the king became more than just a distant figure. To the guard, he was someone real, a leader with a kind smile, a calm voice, and a gentle way of greeting those who served him. Even though they were not friends, the guard felt a quiet bond of respect and loyalty. In recent months, however, the guard had noticed changes. The king appeared less often. The grand gates would open fewer times, and the royal cars would move in and out more quietly than before. There were fewer crowds cheering for his arrival and more silence. Each time the king did appear, he seemed tired. He walked slower, smiled less, and spoke softly. The guard noticed these things, but like every loyal servant, he kept them to himself. Inside the palace, a delicate calm had settled. Staff members moved carefully, their voices softer than usual. Doctors had started visiting more often. They entered through private doors, avoiding the main entrances. Their faces were serious but kind, as if they were carrying news they did not want to share with the world. The guard, though he was stationed outside, saw everything, the special cars, the covered windows, and the increased security around the king's private quarters. Rumors had already begun outside the palace walls. The press whispered, the public wondered, and people online shared every small clue they could find. But no one truly knew what was happening inside. Only a few people, doctors, close family, and a handful of guards understood how serious things were. The guard had no right to speak. His job was to stand strong, to protect, and to stay silent. And for years, silence had been his greatest skill. But that morning was different. Even without words, everyone inside the palace seemed to know something had changed. A feeling moved through the air like a quiet storm. The king's health had been fragile for some time, but now it felt like the situation had grown more delicate. The guard's heart was heavy with worry, though he kept his face still as stone, just like he had been trained. He thought back to the early days when the king would walk through the courtyard and greet staff members with a nod. The king had a way of making people feel seen, even in a crowd. He would stop to ask about someone's family, or smile at a guard standing in the rain. It was these small gestures that made the king loved not just by the nation, but also by the people who worked close to him. To the guard, these weren't just royal duties, they were real moments. Over the years, the guard had watched the king live through celebrations, challenges, and changes in the country. He had seen the joy of the nation during festivals and the quietness of private family gatherings. But he had never seen a time when the king was absent for so long. The palace gardens, usually alive with the sound of his steps, now remained silent. The royal balcony, once a symbol of strength, stayed empty for weeks. As the guard stood at his post, he noticed the way people looked at him. Tourists took pictures, some waved, and others whispered about the king's health. He couldn't respond to anyone. His job was to remain silent and protect the dignity of the royal family. But deep down, their questions echoed his own. He too wanted answers. He too wished the king would step out on the balcony again, smiling as he always did. But each day that didn't happen made the silence feel louder. Inside the palace, everyone moved with quiet purpose. The kitchen staff prepared meals carefully. The housekeeping team spoke in whispers, and the advisors came and went with serious expressions. Even the royal dog seemed to sense the change, walking more slowly near the king's quarters. The guard felt like he was watching a story unfold, not in loud moments but in small details. As hours passed, the sun began to rise higher, shining on the palace gates. The gold details of the building glimmered softly, as if trying to bring warmth to a place that felt unusually cold. The guard's eyes remained fixed forward, but his mind wandered to the moments that had built his loyalty. He remembered the day the king had personally handed medals to the royal guards, thanking them for their service. He remembered the king's calm voice during national events, a voice that reassured millions. Those memories were powerful, and they made the silence of the present even harder to bear. Although the guard never spoke to the king like a friend would, he felt a deep respect for him. To many people, the king was a public figure, a symbol of tradition and history, but to the guard he was also a man with a kind heart, a sense of responsibility, and a quiet strength. It was this human side that made the current situation feel so personal. The guard wasn't the only one who felt this way. Other guards, staff, and even longtime palace workers shared the same quiet concern. They exchanged glances, not words. It was the kind of unspoken understanding that existed only in places where duty and loyalty were stronger than conversation. They all wanted the king to recover, but no one knew what the next day would bring. As the fog began to lift, the world outside the gates slowly came to life. Reporters positioned their cameras, waiting for any sign of movement. Curious onlookers stood behind the barriers, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone who might give them answers. But nothing happened. No cars left, no announcements were made, and no familiar figure appeared at the window. The guard stood firm, just as he had been trained. But beneath the polished boots and perfect uniform, his heart felt heavy. He had promised loyalty and silence, and he would keep that promise. But loyalty didn't mean he couldn't feel. And on that quiet morning, he felt everything: worry, respect, hope, and the weight of a truth the world didn't yet know. As the hours moved slowly, the palace remained a place of calm on the outside but quiet tension on the inside. The guard, standing tall, became a silent witness to history, an unseen observer of moments the world would soon hear about. He didn't know what the coming days would bring, but deep inside he sensed that a chapter in the king's story was about to change. In the distance, the royal flag waved softly in the wind. It had always been a symbol of strength, tradition, and continuity. But to the guard it also carried another meaning that day. It reminded him that even the strongest figures face moments of weakness, and even in silence there is a story waiting to be told. He kept his eyes straight, as he had always done, but this time his heart whispered a quiet hope. He hoped for the king's health, for strength, and for the day when the gates would open again, not with tension but with the sound of joy. Until then he would remain at his post, a loyal guard in front of a palace that held more secrets than the world could imagine. The palace from the outside looked just as grand as it always had. The tall gates, the elegant walls, and the wide courtyard still carried the weight of centuries of tradition. But inside things were slowly changing. The soft whispers of staff members, the quiet footsteps in the hallway, and the distant sound of doors gently closing were all signs of something hidden from the public eye. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't noise. It was a quiet storm, the kind that grows without a sound. The guard, who had spent many years standing faithfully at his post, had begun noticing these little changes more clearly. In the past, there had always been movement. Cheerful chatter from palace workers, friendly greetings, and the echo of busy mornings. But now the palace felt like it was holding its breath. Even the birds that used to fly around the royal gardens seemed to sing less often. Everything felt slower, softer, and heavier. The most noticeable difference was the king's absence. The king had always been someone who loved to walk through the gardens. Even on cold mornings, he would sometimes step outside, smile at the guards, wave to the staff, and take in the air. His presence brought life to the palace, but now the king had not stepped outside for weeks. The windows to his private rooms remained closed. No one saw him walk through the gardens anymore, and his warm greetings were missed deeply. The guard's job was not to ask questions. He had been trained to observe everything but speak of nothing. Yet even in silence, he could feel the tension growing. Doctors were coming more often now. The cars would enter through side gates, avoiding attention. They came at odd hours, sometimes early in the morning and sometimes late at night. The staff did their best to act normal, but their eyes often told another story. It wasn't just the doctors. The advisors, senior members of the royal household, and close family members had been visiting more frequently. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Lights in certain rooms stayed on longer at night. The guard had seen this routine enough to understand what it meant. Something important was happening. Something that no one wanted to say out loud. The king's health had always been a private matter, but this time it was different. The changes were too visible to ignore. The palace, once full of life, now seemed to be living in quiet worry. Even the way people walked down the halls had changed. No one hurried anymore. They moved carefully, as if they were afraid that a single loud step might disturb something fragile. The guard often stood for hours, watching everything without saying a word. He saw the faces of people who came and went. Some of them looked calm but tired. Others looked as if they were carrying a secret they couldn't share. There was a soft sadness in the air, the kind that comes when people care deeply but can't find the right words to express it. At night, the palace looked peaceful from the outside. The golden light shined softly on the walls and the flags moved gently with the wind. Tourists who stood at the gates didn't see the quiet tension inside. They only saw beauty, but the guard, standing there night after night, could feel it. It was in the silence of the windows, the closed doors, and the careful movements of everyone around. He thought about the many years he had served the king. The king was not just a ruler to him. He was a kind man who respected everyone around him. The guard remembered moments when the king would walk up to a group of staff and simply ask, "How are you today?" These small moments mattered. They made people feel valued. That was why so many people loved the king deeply. He was not only a symbol of tradition, but also a man with a heart that cared. Seeing him disappear from public life was hard for everyone. The staff whispered to each other in soft voices when they were sure no one else was listening. They asked each other if they had seen him, if they had heard anything, if they knew when he might appear again. But none of them had answers. The only thing they shared was hope, quiet, fragile hope. As the weeks passed, the changes became more visible. The palace press office stopped announcing public events. Official appearances were canceled one after another. Each cancellation added to the growing worry. The guard often overheard the soft sound of phones ringing inside, quiet conversations between palace workers and officials, and the careful tone they used when they spoke. It was clear they were choosing every word with care. Outside the palace, the public began to notice the silence. People were used to seeing the king, hearing his speeches and watching his appearances. But now he was nowhere to be seen. Newspapers began to publish articles filled with questions. TV reporters stood outside the gates every day, waiting for something to happen. They spoke into their microphones with careful words, saying things like, "The palace remains quiet," and "The public is concerned." The guard could hear them sometimes, though he never turned his head. He stood still, but his mind took in every word. The truth was, he didn't know the full story either. He only knew what he saw, the steady stream of doctors, the quiet movements, the changed faces of the staff, and the silence that seemed to stretch longer every day. Inside the palace, some rooms that were usually open had been closed off. Curtains remained drawn. Hallways that once echoed with laughter and conversations were now quiet. It wasn't sadness like a storm. It was sadness like a soft rain, quiet, steady, and unshakable. Every morning when the guard arrived at his post, he would look up at the windows of the king's quarters. He hoped, even if just for a second, to see a shadow or a light that would tell him the king was awake, moving, recovering. But most mornings the windows stayed still. There were no lights, no movement, just silence. He also noticed how the senior staff carried themselves differently now. In the past, they would walk confidently, their voices clear and strong. Now they walked with careful steps, speaking in soft tones. They avoided eye contact with the press outside, and their faces revealed a quiet worry they tried to hide. The guard remembered the last time he had seen the king in person. It had been a few months ago. The king had walked through the garden slowly, with a gentle smile on his face. His steps had been careful, but his eyes were warm, as they had always been. He had waved to the guards just like he always did. The guard had thought it was a good sign. But that was the last time. Now that memory replayed in his mind often. It was his way of holding on to hope. He told himself that maybe the king would return to the garden again, smiling and waving, and everything would feel normal. But each passing day made that hope feel more distant. The world outside didn't stop. Tourists still came to take pictures. Children still laughed at the sight of the royal guard standing so still. The reporters still waited with their microphones. Life outside the gates went on as it always did, but inside it felt like time had slowed down. The guard didn't speak of these feelings to anyone. It wasn't his place to talk, but inside his heart he carried them heavily. He understood that something was happening, something serious, something that was slowly becoming too big to hide. He also knew that sooner or later the silence would have to be broken. Late one evening, as the palace lights dimmed and the last car left through the side gate, the guard stood under the night sky and breathed in the cool air. He looked at the tall walls, the windows, the flag waving softly, and thought about the man behind it all, the king. He thought about the kind eyes, the warm greetings, the way he treated everyone with respect. It was these memories that made the silence so loud. The palace might have been quiet, but feelings were louder than ever. And deep down, everyone, the staff, the public, the loyal guards, one was waiting for the same thing, a sign of hope, a moment of reassurance, or a voice that would tell them everything was going to be all right. The guard didn't know when that moment would come, but he stood there, strong and silent, ready to face the days ahead. Because sometimes silence isn't just the absence of sound, it's the space where truth slowly begins to reveal itself. The quiet tension inside the palace had been growing for weeks. Everyone could feel it, even though no one dared to say it out loud. But everything changed the evening when the silence finally cracked. The moment didn't come with a grand announcement or a loud noise. It came softly, quietly, like a secret that could no longer stay hidden. That evening, the guard took his usual position at the gates. The sky was covered with clouds and the air carried a light chill. It felt like any other evening. But something was different. The palace staff moved faster than usual. Cars came and went more often. The side entrance, which was normally quiet, saw several vehicles entering in a short time. These weren't just ordinary cars. They belonged to people close to the king. Advisors, family members, and royal officials, all arriving quietly, their faces serious. The guard stood straight, but his eyes were sharp. He had learned over the years to notice small signs. A rushed step, a quiet exchange, a door that closed quickly. All these things told him something important was happening. Deep inside, his heart began to feel heavy. He had felt worried before, but this time was different. This time he felt that something was truly changing. The palace lights, usually bright in the evenings, remained dim. Curtains in the king's private rooms stayed closed. No one went in or out of that area except a few trusted people. The guard saw a doctor step out of one of the side doors, his expression calm but serious. Behind him followed a senior royal advisor, speaking softly into a phone, walking with quick steps. The guard didn't need to hear the words to understand the meaning behind those movements. It was the kind of silence that comes when something delicate is happening. As the night went on, a small group of guards was quietly called to a private area. This was unusual. The royal guards had strict routines, and sudden meetings like this rarely happened. One of the senior officers spoke to them in a low voice. Though the guard couldn't share what was said, he knew the message was clear. The king's condition had taken a serious turn. He felt a chill move through him. Even though he had expected it for weeks, hearing it, even without words, made it real. The king, the man he had served and respected for so many years, was facing something that could no longer be hidden from the world. After the meeting, the guards returned to their posts. Their faces composed, their hearts quiet. They were trained to remain calm no matter the situation, but inside they were not made of stone. They were people who had watched the king up close day after day, year after year. This moment wasn't just duty, it was personal. In the hours that followed, the palace became busier than it had been in weeks. Cars arrived one after another. Some carried family members, others carried trusted officials. The guard could see them from his post. Their faces were serious, some carrying quiet worry, others a calm strength. They walked through the side gates quickly, avoiding the cameras outside. Outside the palace, the world didn't yet know what was happening. Tourists continued to stand by the gates. Reporters held their microphones, trying to get any small piece of news. The public had grown used to the king's absence, but they didn't know how serious it had become. Behind those gates, history was quietly being written. Then it happened. The guard, who had always kept silent, made a choice he never thought he would. It wasn't a loud speech. It wasn't a press conference. It was a simple, honest moment. He had served long enough to understand the weight of loyalty, but he also understood the weight of truth. He spoke quietly to someone he trusted, sharing what many had already feared, that the king's health had taken a serious turn. It wasn't said out of disrespect or carelessness. It was said because the truth had grown too large to keep hidden any longer, and sometimes silence carries more pain than words. The words he spoke didn't stay hidden for long. In a place where everyone was searching for answers, whispers travel fast. Within hours, news began to spread quietly through the press. Reporters who had been waiting for days finally had something real. They didn't have full details, but they had confirmation that something serious was happening inside those walls. When the guard returned to his post, he felt the world outside shift. Reporters began to speak more urgently. Cameras focused more sharply on the gates. The questions grew louder. Is the king all right? Has something happened? Is there an official statement? But the palace remained silent. No official words came out that night. Only the soft glow of the lights and the stillness of the flag waving above the building. Inside, more family members had gathered. It was clear to everyone within those walls that they were living through a turning point, the kind of moment that people would remember for years to come. For the guard, it was surreal. For so many years, he had been just outside these moments, watching quietly. Now he felt like he was standing in the middle of something larger than himself. He remembered the king as he had known him over the years, strong, gentle, kind. He remembered the way he would smile at the guards on cold mornings, the way he would offer a nod, a small sign of respect that meant everything to those who served him. These memories made the present moment even heavier. It wasn't just about a king. It was about a man whose presence had shaped so many lives. The guard didn't know what would happen next. No one did. But he knew one thing clearly. The world would soon know what they had all been quietly living with inside the palace. The truth had a way of finding its way out, no matter how many walls surrounded it. As the night grew darker, the atmosphere around the palace changed completely. Reporters gathered closer. Lights from television cameras reflected off the palace gates. People whispered to each other, their faces filled with worry. They didn't have the full story yet, but they could feel it in the air. Something serious was happening. Inside, staff members moved quickly but quietly. Doctors were present in the private quarters. Senior family members remained close. The guard, standing where he always did, became a silent witness to a moment that would be remembered long after that night had passed. He didn't feel proud or guilty about what he had said. He simply felt human. For years he had stood in silence, watching the king bring comfort to millions of people with his presence. And now, he believed that those same people had a right to know the truth. It wasn't a decision he made lightly. It was a choice born from loyalty, not the kind written in rules, but the kind written in the heart. The next morning, the whispers had turned into headlines. Newspapers, television channels, and online platforms all carried the same story. The king's health had worsened. Though the palace had not yet made an official statement, the news had already reached millions of people. The guard noticed the change immediately. The crowd outside the palace was larger than ever. People were quiet, not loud. They weren't shouting or demanding answers. They were standing together, waiting, hoping. Some held small flags. Others carried flowers. It was as if the entire nation was holding its breath. Inside, the palace remained calm but tense. Everyone knew that the outside world now understood what was happening. There was no going back. The truth had been spoken, and the weight of it was felt by everyone. The royal family was still silent, but their silence now carried a different meaning. It was no longer about hiding. It was about preparing to face the world. The guard continued to stand at his post as he had always done. The difference was that now, he carried a truth the whole world was beginning to see. He didn't regret it. He knew that sometimes moments like this change everything, and this was one of those moments. The palace that had been so quiet for weeks now felt alive again, not with celebration, but with a shared feeling. Inside, outside, near and far, people were united in their concern for the king, and the guard, standing in his familiar place, realized that this was the night when silence broke and the truth finally stepped into the light. The sun rose slowly over the palace the next morning. The sky was soft and gray, and the air outside carried a quiet chill. But this was not an ordinary morning. Something had changed overnight. The world outside the palace gates had learned what the people inside had been living with for weeks. The truth was finally out. The king's health was no longer just a whisper behind closed doors. It was now something the entire nation was talking about. Crowds began to gather early. People came with flowers, small flags, and handwritten notes. Some came alone, others in families. Many wore expressions of quiet worry. No one shouted. No one pushed. There was a calm, respectful silence in the air. The guard standing at his post had never seen the palace like this before. He had seen celebrations, parades, and ceremonies. But this was different. This was a moment of shared emotion. The reporters, who had been waiting outside for days, now had their cameras ready. Their voices were careful. They weren't asking bold questions anymore. They were speaking gently, almost like the nation itself was holding its breath. "The palace remains quiet," one reporter said into her microphone. "The public is waiting for an official word about the king's condition." Inside the palace, the atmosphere was tense but calm. The staff, who had spent weeks trying to carry on as if nothing was wrong, now no longer needed to pretend. The world already knew. This made their steps slower, but their eyes more focused. Every person who worked inside knew that the coming hours would be important. The guard noticed how the security detail had subtly increased. More guards were on duty. More cars entered and left. Everything was quiet but organized. It wasn't chaos. It was careful coordination. The royal household was preparing for something. The king's family members were present in the palace. Though they moved quietly, their presence was felt everywhere. They weren't just royal figures now. They were family, standing by someone they loved. The guard, who had seen many formal royal events, could sense that this was different. This wasn't about ceremony or tradition. This was about people, about emotion, about facing a difficult moment together. Around midday, a small group of officials from the royal press office walked through the courtyard with serious faces. They carried documents and whispered to each other as they moved quickly toward the press room. This was the moment the guard had been expecting. It was clear that an official statement was being prepared. Outside the gates, the crowd continued to grow. People brought flowers and placed them near the barriers. Some held small candles. Others simply stood in silence. Their faces told stories. Stories of love, respect, and years of admiration for the king. He wasn't just a leader to them. He was someone who had been part of their lives for decades. They had seen him on their television screens, heard his voice during national events, and watched him wave from the royal balcony. He had been a steady presence in their lives, and now they were here for him. The guard, standing tall in his uniform, watched as people from all walks of life came together. There were elderly citizens who had followed the king's journey from the beginning. There were young people who had only known him through stories and broadcasts. Some were dressed formally, others casually. But they all shared one feeling and a quiet, genuine concern. Inside, the statement was being finalized. Every word was chosen carefully. The palace had always handled sensitive moments with great care, and this was one of the most delicate moments of all. The royal family wanted to respect their privacy, but also understood that the nation loved the king deeply. The world was waiting for their words. As the afternoon approached, a soft drizzle began to fall. But the crowd didn't leave. People simply opened umbrellas or pulled their coats tighter. Their eyes remained fixed on the palace gates. The soft rain made the moment feel even more emotional. It wasn't a loud scene. It was gentle, like the quiet heartbeat of a nation united in hope. The guard's thoughts wandered to the past once again. He remembered the first time he had seen the king up close. It had been many years ago during a spring ceremony. The king had walked slowly along the path, greeting people with a warm smile. The guard had been young then, standing nervously at attention. But when the king's eyes met his, there had been something kind in that gaze, something real. That moment had stayed with him for all these years. Now standing in the same uniform under the same sky, he realized how much that single smile had meant to him. It wasn't just a memory. It was the reason so many people outside those gates loved the king. He had a way of making everyone feel seen, even in the smallest moments. Around 3 p.m, the palace spokesperson stepped forward to address the press. The guard could not hear every word from his post, but he didn't need to. The quiet reaction of the reporters told him everything. Their faces were serious, their voices soft. They were repeating words that carried weight. Words that the entire world would soon hear on televisions, radios, and phones. Within minutes, the crowd outside began to react. Some people lowered their heads. Others held each other's hands. The king's health had officially been described as serious, but he was surrounded by family and receiving the best medical care. These words weren't surprising. They were confirmation of what many had already known in their hearts. The guard continued to stand still, even as the atmosphere outside grew heavier. But in that heaviness, there was also something beautiful. The way people came together showed just how deeply the king was loved. Strangers who didn't know each other stood side by side, united by a shared feeling. They didn't need to speak. Their presence was enough. Later that evening, candles began to light up near the gates. People placed them carefully on the ground, one after another, creating a gentle glow against the darkening sky. Flowers continued to pile up. Handwritten messages appeared, small notes of love, hope, and gratitude. "We are with you. Stay strong. You are loved." The guard looked at the candles and felt something stir inside him. For years he had stood in this same place, watching history unfold. He had seen grand celebrations and happy events. But this moment, this quiet, heartfelt gathering, was unlike any other. It wasn't about tradition or duty. It was about people's hearts. Inside the palace, the royal family stayed close to the king. Doctors moved quietly through the corridors. Advisors spoke softly. Every sound seemed softer than usual. Even the ticking of the old palace clocks felt slower. The guard could almost feel the weight of time pressing down on everyone. As night fell, the crowd outside didn't shrink. If anything, it grew. More candles, more flowers, more quiet faces looking toward the palace windows. The drizzle had stopped and the night air was cool. The sky was clear now and stars began to appear. But no one wanted to leave. They wanted to stay close, even if they were standing behind tall gates. The guard remained at his post, his posture strong, but inside he felt the emotions of the people around him. He knew that this night would be remembered for a long time, not because of anything loud or dramatic, but because of the quiet unity it created. Everywhere he looked, he saw kindness, a woman gently covering a candle to keep the wind from blowing it out. A child holding a small handmade card with the king's name written carefully on it, an elderly man placing his hat over his heart. These small gestures said more than words ever could. Inside, the king rested, surrounded by those closest to him. Outside, the nation stood with him, silently sending strength and love. And in between those two worlds stood the guard, the silent witness who had seen it all. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill his lungs. The palace flag waved gently above him, the golden lights reflecting softly on the walls. The world had changed in the past 24 hours. The silence that had filled the palace for weeks had finally been replaced with truth, emotion, and unity. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But standing there, watching the quiet glow of candles against the night, he understood something deeply. This was more than a royal moment. It was a human moment, a moment when people came together not out of duty, but out of love. The night had been long, and the palace was wrapped in a quiet stillness that only deep moments in history seemed to carry. The candles outside the gates continued to glow softly, like tiny stars on the ground. The flowers placed by people from every corner of the country now formed a colorful carpet near the entrance. It was as if the world itself had slowed down to breathe gently, together in the same rhythm. The guard had stood through the night without showing any sign of tiredness. Years of service had taught him how to stay still, how to remain calm, and how to carry his emotions quietly inside. But this night had been different from all the nights he had ever experienced. This night was not about ceremony or routine. It was about emotion. It was about love, hope, and an unspoken bond between a nation and its king. Inside the palace, the halls were lit softly with golden light. No grand music played, no formal events were taking place. Instead, quiet voices moved through the corridors. Members of the royal family walked slowly, their faces calm but thoughtful. Doctors continued their careful visits, moving with gentle steps. The air carried the weight of both worry and gratitude. Everyone inside understood how important this moment was, not just for the palace, but for the entire nation. The guard took a deep breath of the cool night air. The stars above the palace seemed brighter than usual, and the flag waved softly in the breeze. He looked at the crowd outside. Many people had chosen to stay all night. Some sat on benches, some on the ground, and some stood wrapped in coats and scarves. Their faces showed warmth, not anger. Their silence was stronger than any words could have been. It was a silence that carried love. As dawn slowly approached, the sky turned a pale shade of blue. Birds began to sing softly from the palace gardens. The light touched the palace walls gently, and everything began to look calm again. But beneath that calmness, everyone knew this was a new beginning, a moment that would shape the future. The guard thought of all the years he had spent here. He remembered the day he had taken his first step inside these gates. He had been a young man full of excitement and pride. He had watched the king grow older, watched the palace change through the seasons, and seen history unfold right in front of his eyes. He had seen the king's smile on bright summer days and his calm strength during difficult winters. And now, he was witnessing a moment that would be remembered forever. In the early hours of the morning, a light drizzle began again. But no one left. People simply opened their umbrellas or pulled their coats closer. The candles flickered gently in the wind, but they didn't go out. That was the thing about love, it didn't disappear with a breeze. It stayed quiet but strong, just like the people who had gathered outside. Inside, the royal family made quiet plans for the days ahead. There were many decisions to be made: how to speak to the public, how to carry forward the king's wishes, and how to keep the country steady in this emotional time. But beyond all the planning, there was one thing they all felt deeply: gratitude. They were moved by how the people had come together, not with noise or anger, but with grace and love. Around mid-morning, a senior palace official stepped outside again. The guard stood straight, watching closely. The official's face was calm, but his steps carried weight. He approached the small platform where press briefings were held. Microphones were already in place, and reporters stood silently, their eyes focused, their cameras ready. The crowd behind them grew quiet, even quieter than before. You could almost hear the sound of the wind moving gently through the flags. The official spoke softly, with words carefully chosen to carry both respect and truth. He thanked the nation for its support, explained the king's current condition, and spoke about the love and kindness that had surrounded the royal family over the last day. His voice was steady, not cold. It carried warmth. Every word was clear and respectful. He didn't give unnecessary details. But the message was strong. The king was in delicate health, surrounded by love, and the royal family was deeply touched by the people's support. When he finished, there was no loud reaction from the crowd, no shouting, no panic. Instead, there was a deep silence followed by soft clapping from a few hands. It wasn't the kind of clapping people do at a performance. It was soft, gentle, a way of saying, "We are with you." The guard watched this and felt something stir inside him again. In all his years, he had stood at the gates during grand celebrations, during parades, and during important political visits. But nothing felt like this. This moment was quiet, but it carried a strength he had never felt before. It was proof that leadership is not only about power or rules. It's also about connection, the invisible bond between a leader and their people. As the day went on, the crowd remained. More flowers arrived. More candles were lit. Schools sent handmade cards. Small children walked with their parents, holding notes with simple words like, "We love you" and "Get well soon." Elderly people, some leaning on walking sticks, stood patiently, as if their presence alone was a gift of strength. The palace staff moved gently, careful not to disturb the calm atmosphere. They understood the importance of every gesture. They offered water to those waiting outside. They helped lay the growing sea of flowers more neatly near the gates. This quiet togetherness gave the moment a kind of beauty that words couldn't fully describe. The guard, though silent as always, felt closer to the people than ever. Usually, the gates separated two worlds, the royal world inside and the public world outside. But now it didn't feel that way. It felt as though they were one, united not by titles or positions, but by shared emotion. Later in the afternoon, the king's health update reached the public again. This time it came through official channels. Gentle words from the royal family expressing their love for the nation and their gratitude for the people's support. These words were read on television, shared online, and repeated in quiet conversations across the country. They brought a calm, reassuring feeling. People outside the palace responded not with loud cheers, but with a peaceful hum of emotion. Some bowed their heads. Others placed their hands on their hearts. A few whispered soft prayers. And the guard, though he said nothing, felt a quiet warmth settle inside him. He knew that this moment, difficult as it was also something special, something that would remain in people's memories for many years to come. As evening arrived, the sky turned golden with the setting sun. The candles that had been burning since the night before were replaced with fresh ones. Flowers were rearranged with care. People didn't want to leave. They wanted to stay as long as they could, to be part of something larger than themselves. Inside the palace, the king rested. Doctors remained near, and the royal family stayed close. The entire household moved softly, respectfully, aware of the love waiting outside the gates. It wasn't just a palace anymore. It was the heart of a nation. The guard, still standing tall at his post, looked around one last time before night fully returned. He saw a child placing a small handmade paper crown next to the flowers. He saw two strangers who had never met before sharing a quiet moment. He saw faces lit by the warm glow of candles. And in that soft light he saw something powerful: hope. He realized that the king, through all his years of service, had given people more than leadership. He had given them unity, and now, in this moment of uncertainty, that unity shined brighter than ever. The night air grew cooler as stars began to fill the sky again, but the guard did not feel cold. He felt steady. He felt proud to stand there even in silence, because he knew this was not just about duty. It was about being part of something real, something human. As the palace flag waved gently above, he whispered quietly to himself, not as a guard, but as a man who had served with heart. This moment, he knew, would not be forgotten. The king's story, whatever came next, would live on in the hearts of millions, and he had been here to witness it all. The night settled softly over the palace once more. Candles glowed. Flowers rested. People stood together, and the guard, loyal as ever, remained at his post, a silent figure between the walls of history and the hearts of the people.